Welcome to the channel where we attempt to fix centuries of historical confusion with nothing but sarcasm and mild contempt. If you landed in America in 1700, you wouldn't think future world power. You'd think, who approved this? There was no United States, no president, no capital, no laws anyone agreed on, no vibes, zero vibes. What you did have was a sad little string of British colonies duct taped to the Atlantic coast, staring nervously at an endless forest like, we're just going to stay right here. Thanks. This was not a country. This was Britain's problem it kept putting off dealing with. Life was a non-stop disaster. Towns were tiny, filthy, and one bad harvest away from chaos. Roads were imaginary. Travel was slow, painful, and often fatal. The average life goal was not freedom, but make it to spring. And for decades, nothing exciting happened. No battles, no heroes, no dramatic turning points. Just people farming, trading, complaining, and slowly realizing that being bossed around by a king who had never set foot there was deeply annoying. This 50-year stretch, from 1700 to 1750, was America's villain origin story. Grievances piled up. Thoughts of independence started percolating. Everyone got very tired. By the time the American Revolution finally kicked the door in, it wasn't a surprise. It was overdue. This is the story of how a forgotten colonial backwater quietly decided, actually, we're done. In 1700, Britain controlled 13 colonies with a grand total of 250,000 people. That's not an empire. That's a small town with delusions of grandeur. Some cities in England had more people than the entire colonial population. So yeah, Britain's big new project was basically a lightly populated beach vacation that had been abandoned halfway through. And these colonies didn't feel connected to each other at all. They were basically 13 strangers stuck in a cabin together and pretending they weren't annoyed. A merchant in Boston had zero in common with a farmer in Pennsylvania or a plantation owner in Virginia. Geography wasn't just shaping how they lived. It was shaping who they were and how much they hated the people in the next region over. In New England, the land was rocky, winters were brutal, and farming was basically a fantasy. So what did they do? They went to the ocean like, fine, if the soil won't cooperate, we'll just exploit the sea instead. Fishing, shipbuilding, and trade became the lifeblood of the region. And religion? Oh, religion was everywhere. Puritan beliefs controlled laws, behavior, and social expectations, because nothing says fun like living under the constant threat of being publicly judged by your neighbor. The middle colonies were different. The soil was rich, the climate was mild, and farming actually worked. Imagine that. These colonies became the breadbasket of colonial America, producing huge amounts of grain. They were also the most diverse and religiously tolerant, basically the cool, laid-back cousins who showed up to family gatherings and everyone secretly liked. Then there were the southern colonies, where wealth meant huge plantations growing tobacco, rice, and indigo. And this whole system ran on enslaved African labor. By the early 1700s, slavery wasn't just part of the economy. It was the economy. It was the foundation, the whole structure, the thing everything else depended on. You get the picture. So yeah, all 13 colonies were British. But they were already becoming completely different societies. Like siblings who grew up in the same house, but turned into totally different people and started avoiding family reunions. The colonies existed mainly to benefit Britain, not to build communities, not to create freedom, not to have nice things, just to serve as Britain's personal money tree. This was part of a system called mercantilism, which is basically a fancy way of saying, you provide the raw materials, we provide the profits, you get nothing. Colonists shipped tobacco, wood, rice, and other goods to Britain. Britain turned those materials into finished products and sold them back to the colonies like, here's your stuff, now buy it from us at a higher price, because that's how the system works. In theory, trade was tightly controlled. In reality, colonists broke the rules constantly because rules are for people who don't want to get rich. Smuggling was everywhere. If trading with the French or Dutch paid better, colonists did it without even pretending to care. They basically treated the British rules like a polite suggestion. And then there was the triangular trade, the most glamorous part of the whole operation, if your idea of glamorous involves suffering. European goods went to Africa. Enslaved Africans were forced across the Atlantic in horrific conditions. Those who survived were sold in the Americas and forced to work producing crops that were shipped back to Europe. So yes, the economy was global, and yes, it was built on pure cruelty and human misery. By 1750, slavery was deeply embedded in colonial life. In South Carolina, enslaved Africans outnumbered white colonists. So naturally, slave codes were created to maintain control, because nothing says civilized like legally enforcing oppression. Even in the North, where slavery wasn't as widespread, merchants still made money from the slave trade. Because profits are profits, no matter how disgusting the source. Colonial prosperity came at a terrible human cost. But hey, Britain got rich, and that's what really matters, right? Everyday life in the colonies was tough. Like, your roof leaks, your shoes are falling apart, and your doctor is basically a guy who watched one surgery on YouTube. Tough. Most people were farmers, working insanely long hours just to not die. Medical care was basically a guessing game. Diseases spread like gossip, and many children didn't survive to adulthood, because apparently growing up was a luxury item. And yet the population grew fast anyway, because nothing says bright future like high birth rates and low survival rates. Families were huge, partly because people needed extra hands to work, and partly because babies were basically free labor. Immigration kept going too. Germans, Scotch-Irish and other groups arrived looking for land and opportunity, which is adorable until you realize opportunity in the colonies often meant good luck not freezing to death. Women did most of the work keeping households running, cooking, cleaning, farming, raising kids, basically running the entire show. But they had almost no legal rights. Once married, a woman's legal identity was basically absorbed by her husband, like she was an app he installed and forgot he was responsible for. Many people arrived in America as indentured servants, agreeing to work for several years to pay off their passage. Some eventually earned freedom and land. Others didn't survive long enough to see it, because the colonial dream was basically work until you collapse. Over time, plantation owners got tired of temporary labor and started relying more and more on slavery, because slavery offered permanent, inherited labor instead of temporary contracts. In other words, they wanted a workforce that couldn't quit. So yeah, life was hard, people kept coming anyway, and the system just kept getting more messed up. But sure, freedom. As colonists pushed west, Native American nations were basically handed a big pile of nonsense and told to make it work. Land was stolen. Treaties were ignored like junk mail. European diseases like smallpox showed up and basically said, "Surprise, we're staying," wiping out whole communities like it was a hobby. Native groups resisted however they could, sometimes through war, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes by teaming up with European powers like, "Sure, let's trust the people who just took our land. Great idea." What could go wrong? Those alliances usually dragged native nations into conflicts that were nothing to do with them, because apparently the best way to solve your problems is to borrow someone else's. One classic example, King George's War in the 1740s. Britain and France were having their little international showdown, and North America was the accidental battlefield. The fighting happened here, but peace deals were signed in Europe, because clearly the people actually living in the area were just optional extras. By 1750, indigenous power east of the Appalachians had been badly weakened. But the idea that native nations were gone? Yeah, that was the fantasy the colonists wanted to believe. Religion also went through a major shift during this time, because the colonies clearly needed more drama. In the early 1700s, church attendance was declining. Faith had become routine, dull and impersonal, basically the spiritual equivalent of microwaving a frozen dinner and calling it a meal. Then came the Great Awakening, because apparently the people needed a spiritual wake-up call delivered by professional guilt trippers. Starting in the 1730s, fiery preachers began traveling from colony to colony like traveling circus acts, preaching emotional sermons about sin, salvation, and personal faith. Jonathan Edwards warned everyone that God was ready to drop the hammer on them like a cosmic Yelp review. Not great, would not recommend. George Whitefield spoke to massive outdoor crowds, sometimes thousands at a time, because nothing screams enlightenment like standing in a muddy field while a guy screams about your soul. People cried, fainted, claimed they were spiritually reborn, which is convenient because apparently the fastest way to prove you're religious is to fall over like you've been hit by a spiritual linebacker. The message was simple. You didn't need church leaders or institutions to connect with God. Faith was personal, and everyone stood equal before God. A concept that was horrifying to anyone who liked having control over other people's beliefs. That idea was powerful. It challenged traditional authority and gave ordinary people a new sense of confidence. It also created a shared experience across the colonies, helping them feel connected in ways they hadn't before. So basically, religion went from boring church routines to mass emotional breakdowns, public fainting, and the sudden realization that you didn't need permission to believe. And that, my friends, is how you accidentally start a revolution. Politically, the colonies were also getting shockingly independent. Like, who gave these people a backbone? Independent. Each colony had a royal governor, basically a fancy British puppet with a wig and a paycheck. But the real power was in the elected assemblies. They controlled taxes and laws, which meant they were basically running the place while the governor stood around looking important and doing what governors do best, nothing. And Britain? Oh, Britain was totally fine with this. They practiced something called salutary neglect, which is a fancy way of saying, we're too busy to enforce rules, so just do whatever you want. Laws were enforced about as strictly as a toddler obeys bedtime. And surprise, it worked. Until it didn't. By 1750, colonists were used to making their own decisions. They didn't see self-government as some kind of royal gift. They saw it as normal, like breathing, like texting, like expecting your coffee to be hot. So when Britain tried to step back in, the colonists were like, oh no, sorry, this is our mess now. On the surface, Colonial America looked like it was thriving, like a toddler in a cape who just discovered glitter and thinks they're ready to run the world. But underneath, well, underneath it was basically a slow-motion dumpster fire, a polite one, with tea. Wealth gaps were getting wider because some colonists were living like they were in a luxury brochure, while everyone else was like, sure, I have a job. It's called trying not to die in winter. Slavery was getting more deeply rooted because apparently the colonies were in a competition to see who could be the most historically problematic. Land conflicts were increasing because colonists kept looking at each other and saying, that's a nice plot of land you have there. Shame if something happened to it. Then they'd start shouting and drawing lines in the dirt, like it was a toddler version of real estate wars. And while colonists still called themselves British, they were starting to feel different. Like, same family, different vibes. Like cousins who used to share toys, but now one cousin has a jet ski and the other cousin has a stick and a dream. To the west, French territory was looming like a big annoying neighbor who keeps saying, oh, you're expanding? How cute. I'll just be over here with my fancy forts and culturally superior attitude. And another major war was coming, because of course it was. Because nothing says we're going to be fine like building a whole empire and then arguing over who gets to pay for it. It was going to change Britain's relationship with the colonies forever. In the same way a breakup changes a relationship. Lots of yelling, tears, and a very dramatic exit. If American history unraveling in real time, with a polite but relentless amount of sarcasm, brought you joy, like and subscribe. Join us next time as we calmly examine the completely unhinged years of 1750 to 1800.